Well, hello again, Links community. Jeffrey Cranford back with you. I hope you enjoyed last week's devotional with Lee Strobel. We talked about he talked about four different things that start with E that we really need to be more versed in. Folks, we have to be equipped. If we're going to go in and really say, I want to have an impact on my club, on my golf community, on somebody I play golf with, and she just never interested in it, you should at least be equipped. And again, I would encourage you, go out and buy Lee's books, give them away. I mean, they're fantastic. He's got a new one, The Case for Easter. I think it's $1, he said. It's unbelievable. So these are things that we can do if we're going to be very intentional about being evangelicals at our clubs. So next, and this is this week's, we have our second, and that's early accounts. There were great early accounts. Well, some of you say, well, I didn't need to know that Jesus was executed. Some people don't even believe that. There are great early accounts, and Lee's going to go into that. Hope you enjoy this morning.
The second E is the most fascinating to me. It stands for early. We have early reports or early accounts that Jesus rose from the dead. Why is that important? Because I used to think, like a lot of skeptics, that, the resurrection, that's a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world. So I figured 100, 150, 200 years after the death of Jesus, stories were invented, mythologies were spun, legends were started, and that's where the idea of the resurrection came from. But what I learned, I think, decimates the claim that the resurrection is a legend. Follow me on this. I think this is fascinating. We have preserved for us a creed of the earliest Christians. Right there in the first century, the first Christians rallied around this creedal statement based on facts that they knew to be true. Now, this creed contains the essence of Christianity. It says Jesus died. Why? For our sins. He was buried. On the third day, he rose from the dead. And then it mentions the specific names of eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses to whom he appeared. Now, what's important about this creed is how immediately it developed after the death of Jesus. Remember, we said it took time for legend to develop? We can date this creed. How? Because the Apostle Paul preserved it for us. He wrote a letter right there in the first century to the church in Corinth. We call it 1 Corinthians. And in that letter, he reminds them implicitly, he says, I already gave you this creed on an earlier visit, but then he reminds them and he gives them this creed in this letter. Now, we can date that letter. We know that Paul wrote that letter 22 years or so after the death of Jesus. And he'd already given the creed to the church in Corinth before then. So that means this creed was in existence within about 20 years of the death of Jesus. Now, we could stop there, and that would be very impressive. When you consider the first two biographies of Alexander the Great by Arrian and Plutarch, written 400 years after his life, and they're generally considered reliable. But we can go back even earlier. How? Because we know historically that Paul used to be Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor, a hater of Christians. 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, he's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Jesus. He becomes the Apostle Paul. What's the first thing he does? He goes into Damascus and he meets with some apostles. Many scholars believe this is when they gave him this creed that he later wrote in the letter to the church in Corinth. But other scholars are a little more skeptical. They say, well, wait a minute. It may have been 3 years later. 3 years later, Paul goes to Jerusalem and he meets for 15 days with two eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus who are specifically named in the creed, Peter and James. The Greek word that Paul uses to describe that encounter, that 2-week encounter, hysterio, suggests that this was an investigative encounter. They weren't talking about the Super Bowl, They weren't talking about the windy weather. What are they talking about? What did you know? What did you see? They're checking each other out. Some scholars say this is when Paul was given the creed by two people named in the creed. But either way, this means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed is already in existence. Therefore, the beliefs that make up that creed go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. Friends, there is no huge time gap between the death of Jesus and the later development of a legend that he rose from the dead. We got a news flash that goes right back to the beginning. In fact, one of the greatest scholars in this area is Dr. James D.G. Dunn, and he says this. He says, this tradition, by that he means this creed, we can be entirely confident was formulated as a creed, as tradition, within months of the death of Jesus. Within months. That historians drool over this stuff. This is a news flash from ancient history. I was recently talking to one of the greatest historians in the world on the resurrection, and he told me privately, he said, nah, it was within weeks. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Especially when you consider that one of the greatest historians who ever lived, A.N. Sherwin White of Oxford, studied the rate at which legend developed in the ancient world. And he determined that the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. We don't have 2 generations of time passing here. We got a news flash that goes right back to the beginning. And it's not the only early report we've got. We've got others in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, elsewhere in the New Testament that date back so early that they were circulating during the lifetimes of Jesus' contemporaries who would have been all too happy to point out the errors if they were making this stuff up.